Well, this white thing is a luminous shape that appeared at night in Cairo in 1968 in the middle of the street on the roof of a church in front of nearly 1 million people who had gathered to see it. Several 100,000 individuals report having seen this shape appear, move in the air, and then disappear a few hours later. And as you can see, the strange apparition was even captured in a photograph. But this is nothing compared to what I discovered while investigating this case. I will tell you the story of what is one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. Let's start from the beginning. It is April 2nd, 1968, in the late afternoon in Zeitoun, a neighborhood in Cairo, Egypt. Many mechanics are still in the bus garage in front of a beautiful Coptic church, the only one in this neighborhood, indeed, by the way. Suddenly, they just see on the roof of this church a white shape that resembles a human. He spontaneously thinks that it might be a nun in a white habit, but since she is standing on a rounded and slippery surface, he shouts to her to be careful and to wait. As these events are quite recent, they are very well documented, and we can know all of this with precision, as the various witnesses, all Muslims here, will testify later. We have therefore carefully kept their names. There are, for example, 2 bus drivers, Farouk Madam Atwa and Ramut Hafifi Hussein Hawad, who is a mechanic, or Abdel El Haziz Ali, a guard. One of them, fearing the person dressed in white on the roof of the church might be someone wanting to commit suicide, alerts police. Another one spontaneously goes to knock on the door of the church. There, on the side of the church, lives the family of Father Yusuf Ibrahim. It should be noted that among the Copts, married men can indeed become priests. It is the son of priest Yusuf Ibrahim who will hear the man knocking at the door that evening. His name is Adel Yusuf Ibrahim and he is 18 years old. Having become a priest later, he is now called Father Constantine. And here is an excerpt from a testimony he gave again in March 2004. I opened the window of my room and asked, "What is happening?" The man told me, "Your sister. She is on top of the church and she is going to kill herself." I replied, "My sister is here and she is sleeping. She is inside, she is not on top of the church." Although barefoot, I jumped out of the window to see who had climbed the church. Once outside, Adel Yusuf realizes the luminous shape and immediately thinks it must be the Virgin Mary. He informs his father, who in turn informs his superior, Father Constantine Yusuf. Meanwhile, a large crowd had gathered on Toman Bay Street, the street in front of the church, causing traffic to be interrupted. Then after a few minutes, the apparition disappears. All those who saw are in shock. The dome on the roof of the church is almost completely inaccessible. So, who could have climbed up there and then disappeared without a trace? Many believers think they recognize the Virgin Mary, but among the crowd, there is mostly a majority of Muslims. Well, in fact, we are just at the beginning of our story. What these people do not yet know is that new apparitions will occur in the same place, on the roof of the church, many times over more than 3 years, from April 2nd, 1968, until June 1971, and that many investigations, including police ones, will take place. So we are not at the end of our surprises. So let's move on. You will certainly see that the next part is much more interesting. On the night that follows, April 3rd, around 3 a.m., a new apparition of this mysterious woman occurs in a kind of white or golden light, and in fact, it doesn't stop anymore. In the first weeks, the apparitions will take place almost every night. Well, try to imagine what that must have been like. You live in Cairo and several friends and colleagues say they have seen the Virgin on the roof of a church. Very quickly, the information spreads like wildfire. Everyone is only talking about that. Skeptical, quite normal before something so big you want to check, since you are assured that the Virgin appears almost all the time, every night. You go to the site at dusk and wait, your eyes fixed on the roof of the church, like many other people on the street who have all come specifically for this. And suddenly, the luminous figure, which resembles a woman with a halo on her head, appears. The most impressive apparitions will take place between April 27th, 1968 and June 15th, 1968. During those weeks, many Egyptians go to Zeitoun to see the apparitions with their own eyes. The police begin to worry about all these gatherings, and the press focuses on it. Here shows the front page of the Egyptian newspaper Al-Haram from April 27th, 1968. A huge crowd is gazing skyward at the church roof. And in fact, absolutely all the press is talking about it, whether it's the newspapers Al-Jamouria, Al-Habar, the Egyptian Gazette, Wagi Le Progrès Dimanche, etc. Well, I won't list all the names because it won't mean anything to you anyway. It is estimated that for the year 1968, the average number of people present during the apparitions was 50,000 and could rise to 100,000 on certain nights. This is what most of the press articles we have preserved state. Some even speak of a record of 250,000 people at the same time, but after a certain number, and since it was night, it becomes difficult to be precise. Among these thousands of people, we still have today the record of many testimonies claiming to have seen the Virgin without being contradicted by other witnesses. Well, I can guess the expression you are making right now, but know that even if what I am telling you may seem a bit strange, it is not a completely made-up legend. Indeed, we have evidence that many people claimed to have seen the Virgin between 1968 and 1971 in Zeitoun. Now, that doesn't mean she actually appeared, but it does mean that a phenomenon actually occurred during which a luminous woman was seen on the roof of the Coptic church by more than 1 million people in total. Obama. These are the facts. Now, what we are going to do in this investigation is to see if there are other hypotheses than a miracle that could explain this phenomenon. Because yes, as I mentioned in the first inexplicable mystery in my previous video, we must first try to explore all possible hypotheses before shouting, miracle. In short, well, let's get started. I have listed for you 5 other hypotheses that could naturally explain this phenomenon without having to say that it is a miracle and a real apparition of the Virgin Mary. First alternative hypothesis, did the witnesses lie? Second hypothesis, was it a collective hallucination? Third hypothesis, was it simply a person in disguise? Fourth hypothesis, was the apparition a hologram or any other technology created by humans? Fifth hypothesis, was it a UFO or an extraterrestrial object? Well, we will take these 5 hypotheses in order, see what each one is worth, and proceed by elimination. If and only if we have good reasons to think that all these hypotheses are false, then, since we must accept reality and the elements as they are, we may have to face the evidence and accept that it might have been a true apparition of Mary. It is not absolutely impossible after all, we must be open to everything. But first, let's examine the hypotheses one by one to see what they are worth. So, first hypothesis, did all the witnesses lie and invent their account from scratch? This hypothesis raises many problems. First of all, the witnesses were far too numerous, did not all know each other, and were not all believers. In fact, there was a majority of Muslims. Now, even though Muslims do honor Mary, the mother of Jesus, they would have no interest in inventing a story where she appears above a Christian church. Here, for example, is the testimony of a Muslim who initially doubted. His name is Marian, and he lived about 300 meters from the church of Zeitoun. One evening, he first heard screams coming from the direction of the church and sent someone to see what was happening. He was told that people were seeing unusual lights. Honestly, he did not want to go out for that and decided to stay at home. But the screams continued all night, and the next day, everyone was talking about the apparition that supposedly took place the day before. Astonished, Marian then goes to the site in the morning. He finds the usual remnants of a crowd everywhere on the ground. Empty cigarette packs, cans, greasy paper, etc. Nothing very exciting, but at least proof that something had happened. In the evening, he prepares to follow the event live with binoculars and a camera. But when he wants to go out around 7 p.m., all the streets in the neighborhood are already filled with a crowd so dense, so tight, so compact, including in front of his door, that he can't even get out of his house. He goes back up to his apartment, but around midnight, 5 or 6 friends come to get him, and one of them, although an atheist, tells him, "You have to go see. I believe in nothing. This is the first time I'm starting to believe in something. It's incredible. It's unheard of. You have to come." This time, in a group and holding hands, they manage to push through and make their way through the crowd. And in half an hour, they reach a spot from where they can see the roof of the church. Marian will later testify about that moment. You are in shock you see the Virgin, or a lighting that resembles it. That can only be that. So there is a person there in light. She was only in light. And then, it's so real, it's so beautiful, you see, I can't explain it to you. You can't see something more beautiful than that. It's a person you see who is smiling, who wants to talk, who wants to say something to the world, who is giving something, a blessing. I don't know how to explain it. I was completely overwhelmed. So, here is a testimony from a Muslim. You will tell me, and you would be right, that an isolated testimony in itself would not prove much. For example, if a person comes to you and says that they had an apparition of the Virgin, well, that's cool, right? And it might be true, but in itself, it only rests on their own testimony. So unless she gives you good reasons to believe what she says, it's certainly not very convincing. Now, if 10 people tell you that they had an apparition of the Virgin, that starts to be much more interesting. But if they all know each other and are all believers right away, that doesn't reassure too much. On the other hand, if you have 100 people who do not all know each other, and among them there are several atheists and skeptics who all tell you that they had an apparition of the Virgin in the street, then it immediately becomes impossible to say that they all lied. The Virgin may not have necessarily appeared to them, but the least we can grant them is that they truly believe they saw something or someone that resembled the Virgin. Well, for these apparitions of Zeitoun, we don't just have 100 people who said they saw the Virgin, but hundreds of thousands, even millions, over several years. We simply cannot deny that something happened. And the hypothesis of a collective lie simply does not hold. Second hypothesis: could the witnesses all have been victims of a collective hallucination? So, for those who don't know, a collective hallucination is when a group of people sees or hears the same thing that doesn't actually exist because they are influenced by emotions, beliefs, or group pressure. For example, 3 friends are around a table in a living room, and one of them thinks he hears voices upstairs when there is no one there. He asks the others if they can hear them, tells them to focus and by insisting, the others end up believing they hear them too in the distance, while in reality, there is nothing. But in fact, we need to distinguish between collective hallucinations, which involve a group seeing something that doesn't really exist, and collective psychoses, which involve a group feeling an inner impression like stress or anxiety that can spread within a group. However, collective psychoses do not concern a clear and precise vision of something. While collective psychoses are documented, this is not at all the case for collective hallucinations, and we should not confuse the two. For example, a case of collective psychosis was observed in 1977 in the United States during a sporting event. 57 members of an orchestra then begin to suffer from headaches, nausea, dizziness, and fainting. And yet, the paramedics find no cause for this. Of course, it was hot, but still, researchers believe that some musicians suffered from heat stroke. This spread to the rest of the group from stress. Some became anxious seeing others unwell, and out of fear that it would happen to them too, they themselves ended up feeling unwell. On the other hand, there is no documented experience where a true collective hallucination occurred, in the sense that several people clearly saw things that do not actually exist. That is why only collective psychoses are indeed recognized by science, and even then, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, no longer even recognizes this disorder. As for the ICD-10, the International Classification of Diseases, it lists the induced delusional disorder. But regarding collective visual hallucinations, as I mentioned in a previous investigation I conducted on Jesus, in reality, we have no evidence that they exist. The psychoanalyst Gary Collins states it clearly. By their very nature, a given hallucination can only be seen by one person at a time. They certainly cannot be seen by a group of people. And yes, in fact, it seems logical. Even if one can conceive that a person becomes stressed and thus unwell due to a group that is itself unwell, or believes they vaguely hear something in the distance if pressed, which is therefore a collective psychosis, it is much more difficult to imagine that they could see something very clearly with their eyes, for the sole reason that others would tell them there is something. Very clear visual hallucinations cannot therefore be collective. In any case, no scientific experiment has ever proven that it is possible. Some believe that the apparitions of the Virgin Mary prove that collective hallucinations are possible, as many people claim to have seen the Virgin Mary. But this is circular reasoning. This apparition of Mary is probably a collective hallucination. And what proves that collective hallucinations exist? Well, exactly this apparition of Mary. In any case, science does not work that way, as you have understood, and despite real evidence of the existence of collective hallucinations, we can immediately dismiss this unfounded and absurd hypothesis. And in fact, even if collective hallucinations were possible, which is not the case here, in Zeitoun, common sense allows us to dismiss this hypothesis. Indeed, we are faced with many people who claim to have seen the Virgin Mary clearly for months, and sometimes non-believers. Not everyone has the same disposition to experience an induced delusional disturbance. Some people were atheists and skeptics, coming to Zeitoun to witness the event. They were not going to be fooled and see a luminous shape on the roof of the church. Imagine, you are in the crowd. You are skeptical. You look up at the roof of the church. Obviously, just because someone next to you says, "Look on the roof, there's the Virgin," doesn't mean that the Virgin would suddenly appear very clearly and distinctly on the roof of the church in your line of sight. You might let yourself be a little influenced. Something exists, seeing it appear before your eyes. Even the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, came twice to witness the event himself and also acknowledged having seen the presence of the luminous woman, in short. However, it must be said that some rare individuals did not see the Virgin Mary. For example, we have the testimony of a woman, Mrs. Zarif, the wife of a banker, who is deeply religious, who however did not see the Virgin Mary right away. Distressed, she persevered and came to the street for several weeks, hoping to see the apparition. It eventually happened to her, and like all the other testimonies of those who saw the apparition, she then knew that it was more real than reality and had no doubt about what she was seeing. For example, Dr. Zarif Mata, who saw only one apparition, that of June 1st, 1968 at 9:15 p.m., will testify, "I was rubbing my eyes as looking so intensely blurred my vision, but she was still there." The people who see the apparition have no doubt about its reality, which is the opposite of what one might expect in the induced delirious disturbance that takes time to subtly settle in for small things, like a heat stroke, for example. One can say that not all fruits are apples, but all apples are fruits. Let me explain. Not everyone saw the apparition, but all those who did are confident and have no doubt, which is not the case in collective psychoses. If group hallucinations existed, and if there had been one in Zeitoun, we might have expected that believers would see it more easily than non-believers, but that was not the case. It was even sometimes the opposite. Very pious people like Mrs. Zarif did not see her right away, while atheists and skeptics saw her directly and easily. In short, besides that, for the apparitions of Mary in Zeitoun, we even have photos. Yes, the apparition was even photographed several times. This really definitively eliminates the hypotheses of lies or collective hallucinations. Even if all the other arguments I presented to you before were already sufficient, these photos lead us to consider the third hypothesis. Could the woman be a disguised person? This idea poses too many problems. The person is luminous, even on her face, sometimes lighting up the entire crowd. What disguise could emit so much light evenly distributed over the entire body? Even with today's technology, 50 years later, such a bright and uniform disguise, without seeing any bulbs or spots, even on the face, seems impossible to create. Secondly, the roof is completely inaccessible from the outside. From the inside, one must use a ladder to access the dome. However, the church was quickly monitored perfectly by the police, who saw these phenomena as potentially a disturbance to public order. How would a person have managed to go up there very regularly while everything was perfectly monitored, and this for more than 3 years, sometimes with a security perimeter around the entire neighborhood? Thirdly, and this argument definitively eliminates the hypothesis of a disguised person, there have been several times luminous doves seen by witnesses floating around the apparition, yet without flapping their wings. And the apparition itself, at times, floated several meters above the dome. It did not always touch the ground. Let's also say a word about these photos. Some criticize their poor quality, and it's true that, between us, well, you can't see much. So it must be said, it's still enough to recognize the silhouette of the Virgin Mary. But if we're honest, it's true that we would have liked some clearer photos. However, we must say that the photos are just a bonus, and it's not that alone that will tell us whether it's a miracle or not. It could always be a hologram, as we will see in the next hypothesis. Many ask for photos or videos to believe in the supernatural. They would like miracles filmed live. And they say the day some exist, they will believe in God. Be careful. There is no need for photos and videos to know something really happened. As I mentioned in my last investigation, we know perfectly well that Julius Caesar existed, and yet we have no photos or videos. Photos and videos are a type of evidence, but that's not all. There are also testimonies, as I mentioned, which must be taken into account, if they are numerous and confirm each other, by independent individuals from one another. The majority of our current knowledge is, in fact, based on testimonies. Anyway, there are events that seem supernatural and are filmed or photographed live, believe it. There are some, and we will see them in other of the 100 unexplained mysteries that I will cover on my channel. I hope you're subscribed so you don't miss that. Moreover, it only takes you a few seconds, but it's a big support for me, so thank you in advance. Miracle photos and videos are not at all necessary evidence to believe in the supernatural. Moreover, they will always pose a problem. Indeed, if the photos are of poor quality, there will be complaints, but if they are of good quality, of course, we will cry foul play. So in any case, we remain free, to believe or not, and fortunately. As for the fact there are few photos of the Zeitoun events, there are two things to respond to that. First, it needs to be put into context. Today, everyone has a smartphone, but in the 1960s, cameras were expensive, their technology was limited, and good lighting was needed to take photos. Basically, very few people had them. Secondly, there were still photographers sent by the press and other magazines, but during the development of almost all the photographs, out of hundreds and hundreds of photos, a very strange phenomenon occurred. Absolutely nothing of the apparition appeared. Why? Well, you will see that I will come back to this later in the video. In short, let's close the parenthesis. And now let's look at our fourth hypothesis. If it wasn't a disguised person, maybe it was a hologram or an image created with any other projection equipment. Well, keep in mind that at the time, none of the first three hypotheses would have come to the mind of an Egyptian. The fact that everyone could have lied, that everyone could have been a victim of a collective hallucination, or that it was a disguised person, would not have occurred to anyone, as it would have been so grotesque in relation to the event itself. On the other hand, this fourth hypothesis, the hypothesis of a hologram, is already a little more interesting. Already, before delving deeper into this hypothesis, of those who saw the apparition, none had any doubt that it was truly the Virgin Mary. All the testimonies we have show us how moved the people were, and beyond the visual aspect, how much they felt a grace, a particular presence. And this, once again, even from the witnesses who would have had no interest in recognizing the Virgin Mary in this phenomenon. I told you, there were many Muslims among the witnesses. I gave you a testimony from one of them among many others, but in reality, there were so many that all the masters would make this video exceed the maximum duration of videos on YouTube. So, here is another example that shows that the hundreds of thousands of Egyptians who saw the apparition were convinced that it was the Virgin Mary. It is a man whom the Minister of Labor and one of the officials of Egyptian television met. Muslim was initially violently hostile. He insulted the pilgrims going to church. He threw stones at them and called the police to arrest them. The Virgin appeared to him and asked him why he was behaving this way. She asked him not to continue and advised him to paint a cross on his house. While remaining a Muslim, he was so convinced of the authenticity of the apparitions that he painted 40 large crosses on all the walls of his house. And you can imagine the risks he was taking in doing this in front of the Muslim community. But that's not all. Besides Muslims and atheists, we also have many testimonies from Protestants. Protestants are those Christians who do not believe in the Catholic Church Jesus founded. Often they respect Mary, but think she cannot be the same, cannot appear. I had actually surveyed on the differences between Protestantism and Catholicism. Feel free to check it out. In short, and yet, many Protestants recognized the presence of the Virgin Mary in the apparition and were deeply moved by this encounter. This was the case of Radi Tadros Chumbo, who saw the Virgin one evening and said, "I saw the Virgin. I saw her fully. It was not shadows. I had the feeling that something was going to happen. A fine ray or fringe of light appeared, like when you open a door that leads to a lit room. Within seconds, this light took the form of the Virgin. I was speechless. Everyone who was there with me exclaimed, 'It's not possible!' The Muslims began to cry. This vision lasted 5 minutes. I could only see color difference in the skin of the face and hands and that of the veil. There was a bit of color on the face and hands. It was clear when the Virgin came and went. When she disappeared, the people on the other side shouted they saw her. Then, she returned to our side for 5 minutes. On the central dome, I saw Mary completely standing in front of the cross. I cannot describe what I felt. There were a few doves, 6 or 7 above the church. Well, thank you for this testimony, dear Radi, but let's return to our hologram hypothesis. To determine if this can be credible, let's delve a little deeper into all the details of the apparition that we know from the numerous testimonies. Well, yes, what was the person who resembles the Virgin Mary doing during these phenomena? Was she moving? Was she speaking? Was she flying? Where and how did she appear precisely? If we can gather as many elements as possible, it will help us later to know if we are dealing with some sort of hologram or not. Because up until now, I haven't told you much about these apparitions as such. And you will see, however, that what happened during these phenomena is beyond understanding. Before we begin, how do I know all this? Because, well, I'm here in my little chair, but how do you know where I get all my information from? In other words, what my sources are. In fact, to make this video, I relied on the book by Father Francois Brune, the Virgin of Egypt, who investigated this case in depth and personally met many witnesses. So, if you want to know more, all the additional information is in this book. I will put a link in the description. And while I'm at it, before I close my parenthesis, for those who want to know more about the Catholic faith and the supernatural in general, there is nothing. An excellent newsletter that I recommend, it's called Edifiant.fr, and you will receive an in-depth investigative report each month on different topics. It's a newsletter that complements my videos. The reports are rigorous. So if you're really looking for the truth, if you want to dig deeper, go subscribe there as well. Link in the description. Now let's return to what the silhouette was doing precisely during the alleged apparitions. In reality, none of the hundreds of times the apparition occurred were the same from one time to another. The Virgin Mary could appear in different places, do different things, be accompanied by different people or animals, and even be dressed differently. Basically, I told you that she appeared on the roof to simplify things a bit, but the reality is a little more complex. If we cross-reference all the testimonies we have, here's what it shows. First of all, in terms of duration, the apparitions could last from a few minutes to several hours. From June 8 to 9, 1968, the apparition lasted from 9 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. That is 7 hours and 30 minutes. The silhouette was silent. Unlike other Catholic apparitions, if it is the Virgin, she said nothing. So maybe you're wondering what the point is of appearing if she doesn't say anything. Well, we will come back to that later, if we can confirm that we are indeed dealing with a real apparition of the Mother of Jesus. Let's continue. The silhouette appeared inside the church itself, under the dome, and then exited by crossing through the stained glass windows. It also sometimes manifested on the trees around, a palm tree, and a small olive tree near the church. One of her apparitions lasted 3 hours 30 minutes. The leaves of the tree under her feet sparkled, large diamonds. But she also appeared far from any building, away from the trees, simply floating in the air at a very low height. Her form was also very variable. Sometimes it was just a luminous shape, quite vague, like a sort of cloud. Sometimes you saw her clothes very clearly, the veil on her head, white, blue. Others saw other colors, pink, green, but always pale. At least once, she appeared without a veil, her hair falling to her shoulders. She even manifested wearing a crown. One could clearly distinguish her features and even the expression on her face. People noted that she was always gentle, often smiling, but sometimes also serious and sad. Her height could also change, not just from one apparition to another, but during the same apparition, giving the impression of growing up to twice her normal size. She manifested at least once as a little girl of 12 or 13 years old. She sometimes disappeared suddenly, but could also fade gradually, becoming progressively transparent, starting from the bottom. Often, she would vanish as she had appeared, that is to say, seeming to emerge from a cloud and dissolve back into it, or as if coming out through a mysterious door, opening onto another dimension and departing through the same opening into the beyond. She was almost always like luminous, phosphorescent. Sometimes this light would be so intense that it took some time to distinguish the Virgin who stood out from it, a bit like when our eyes need to adjust to darkness. Well, there, they had to adjust to the light. She was sometimes surrounded by a luminous halo or just an aura around her head. Both could indeed disappear suddenly during the apparition. However, it happened to her, although very rarely, to appear without light, like a normal opaque body. In fact, there were not really any rules. As for her movements, the Virgin did not remain still. She often moved on the dome of the church, turning to the right and left so that everyone could see her. She did not seem to walk, gliding through the air. She even leaned towards the crowd nearby, as the church is located at the corner of two streets. She knelt before the cross of the central dome with her hands joined, like this. She raised her right arm to bless the crowd, sometimes holding an olive branch or a cross. Witnesses recount that her clothes followed her movements or seemed to float in the wind. Before disappearing, she often made a sort of farewell gesture. She also sometimes appeared holding a baby in her arms. There are even accounts where she seemed to gently toss him in the air to catch him in her arms, as one does when playing with a child. But sometimes this lady and her baby appeared more solemn. The child appeared to be about 12 years old, and both were wearing crowns. At least once, another man appeared with them. We likely have here Mary, her child Jesus, and her putative father Joseph, if the apparition is authentic. Let's move on. The Virgin apparition was preceded by different luminous appearances, silent flashes or a shower of stars. The light often spread during the apparition over the domes themselves, or came and went several times along the domes. Sometimes she would sweep the wall of the church. When the image of the Virgin turned towards one cement cross, it could become luminous. Other lights could also appear, like stars, but much larger. Even the cross of the central dome, which is normally opaque, could become luminous before, during, and after the apparitions. We also saw birds larger than doves, of dazzling whiteness, gliding but without flapping, yet very fast. Their color exceeded white, meaning they seemed to emanate light, as if illuminated from within. They could even manifest during nights without the apparition of the Virgin. These birds never landed, neither on the church nor on the trees. They sometimes seem to emerge from one of the domes, even though these do not have openings, only stained glass windows that, in fact, cannot even be opened. We did not see them arrive or move away to disappear. They appeared and disappeared suddenly. Several times, although rarely, the apparitions took place in daylight. Well, we won't continue like this with these descriptions for hours. I believe you understand the idea. The apparitions, to make it short, were relatively grand phenomena. A bit like sound and light shows, one could say today. Well, without the sound, of course. It wasn't just a woman wandering for 5 minutes on the roof of a church, you know. If we return to the hologram idea, it raises a few issues. First, I remind you that the church was constantly monitored during apparitions, both inside and outside, by the police who were conducting an investigation. I will actually share their conclusion with you in a moment. To put it differently, no light source was detected, either in the church or on the neighboring buildings. Moreover, people are not stupid. Thus, from the beginning, skeptics tried to explain the light forms as reflections. Some even climbed the walls to tear down the electrical wires. Others climbed the trees to shake their leaves because they thought they were sending reflections. One night, wanting to prove that this light came from the streetlights, the police broke one without disturbing the apparition. Another time, the power was cut, plunging the entire neighborhood into darkness. The apparition still took place. Then, the trees were either cut down or trimmed and turned into poles without the apparition stopping. The police conducted a thorough investigation throughout the area, sometimes very far from the church, to discover if these light apparitions could possibly be produced by any technical installation. Result: nothing. Nada. Nothing. Some even went so far as to suspect an operation by the Egyptian tourism ministry to attract more foreigners. Since the power was cut several times by the police and the apparitions continued anyway, I have heard some discussing this case say that perhaps the hologram could have been connected to a portable battery. And even if it seems like an enticing theory, it is actually a cruel misunderstanding of the technical skills of the time. Alright, let's do 20 seconds of more technical stuff, but don't worry, it will be short. The batteries at the time had what we call a much lower energy density than today. Energy density is the amount of energy a battery can store relative to its weight. The higher the energy density, the more energy the battery can provide while remaining light. Conversely, the lower the energy density, the heavier the battery will be, if we want it to provide energy. In short, at the time, batteries weighed much more for much less capacity. Roughly speaking, the average energy density was 60 to 65 1 per kilos of battery. Is that an approximation? There were different types of batteries: lead-acid battery, nickel-cadmium battery, zinc-carbon battery. So, I had a bit of fun and asked ChatGPT to roughly calculate how much energy an hologram reproducing the appearances of Zeitoun would consume. If it were possible, because small spoiler, it is not the case, but we will see that in a moment. I'll skip the details. At the time, it would have taken a battery of over 3 tons to power this event for 7 hours. It is clear that it is impossible to bring such a battery onto the roof of the church via a tiny ladder leading to the dome. As for the hologram technique itself, well, let's get to it. Indeed, it was in the early 1960s that this technology emerged. But the holograms of that time were nothing like what we can do today. It was really the very beginning. It was done only in laboratories with a lot of equipment, and holograms visible in white light or in outdoor conditions were absolutely not feasible. Moreover, even today, 50 years later, the most advanced holograms still would not be able to reproduce the phenomena of Zeitoun. Indeed, even modern holograms have limitations. They require physical supports or controlled environments to be visible. The apparitions of Zeitoun were extremely bright, changed shape and size, moved in complex ways among the trees, in the air, through the stained glass, through birds, sometimes in broad daylight, etc. Reproducing all of that, even with today's hologram technology, remains completely impossible. Moreover, I haven't told you everything. Well, yes, otherwise it wouldn't be fun. I saved the best for last. Most witnesses report that often, during the apparitions, dancing scents of roses emanated from the church, and the smell lingered long afterward. Sometimes this phenomenon manifested before the apparition, but it could also occur only after the Virgin's departure. It was so dense that it formed a kind of fog that completely enveloped the church. This scent was extremely strong. Some saw one day this fog coming out of the stained glass, which was sealed. Even the best holograms cannot do that. And I remind you that there was an investigation, and it found nothing that could explain these mysterious odors and fumes. There is also another much stronger element, but I'll save it for later. So, it's time to share the conclusions of this investigation that I have mentioned several times. It was notably led by the governor of the city of Cairo and Colonel Saad Zayed. A report emerged from it, published by the Director of Information on behalf of the Minister of Tourism. Here is an excerpt. An official investigation was conducted, the conclusion of which is that the apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary on the Church of Zeitoun in a clear and very bright body, seen by all present, Christians or Muslims, is an undeniable fact. And indeed, unless it is the last hypothesis of extraterrestrials that I will talk about again in It seems that there may indeed have been a real supernatural phenomenon there. The only way to deny it, in any case, would be to completely dismiss the hundreds of thousands of testimonies by saying they are worthless. But that seems absurd, because a large number of consistent testimonies generally constitute solid evidence, at least in legal trials. Oh, by the way, the serious investigation conducted by the civil authorities ensured that the roof of the church was checked. And obviously, no trace of batteries, cables, or any projection materials whatsoever. Or more generally, no trace of anyone's passage was ever found. But I know that some of you are wondering if the church roof was checked during an apparition. In reality, a bishop, Mzikta Amba Athanasios, Bishop of Beni Suef, came specifically to the site to investigate and tried to do so on the night of April 29th to 30, 1968. He would later testify that he had asked for the church to be turned off and in the dark. And here is the experience he had on the last small ladder leading to the dome. I started to climb, and I remember as I stood on the ladder, I was looking at the ceiling of the church, praying that the people in the streets could not see me. It was then that I was seized by tremors. I was gripping the ladder, but it started to shake with me, and I was shivering. I understood that something extraordinary was happening. I'll keep it short. Essentially, he did not dare to go any further. He was afraid of finding himself face to face with the Virgin Mary and went back down. We can still be grateful to this bishop for his attempt. It convincingly confirms that it could not have been a hoax. Well, yes, the church was in darkness, and yet entire crowds at the same time saw this luminous shape. Now, as I told you, the hologram, besides being impossible, could not work on batteries. And then we can understand why this bishop did not dare to go all the way up, because as the 4 hypotheses I have mentioned so far are not convincing at all, he knew that if he went up to the dome, he would really find himself face to face with the Virgin Mary. Well, okay, or face to face with aliens. But in any case, we can be sure of one thing: the lack of verification of the roof during an apparition is absolutely not a problem. And we do not need that at all to throw the first 4 hypotheses in the trash, as we have seen. The fact no one went up during the apparitions should be seen as a mark of respect towards her who thought she was the mother of Jesus. But aside from that, the church was constantly monitored. In short, if we want to accept reality and not be in denial about the elements we have, it seems that we must accept that a supernatural apparition really occurred, unless this apparition came from aliens. So, let's quickly look at this 5th hypothesis. First of all, the first point that comes to mind is, why? Why would aliens come to impersonate the Virgin Mary on the roof of a church without saying anything for several years and then suddenly stop completely? Would it just be for fun? Well, of course, I know what you're going to say. If it is really the Virgin Mary who appeared, we also have the question of why, so why would she have appeared? But I promise you, we will come back to that in a moment, and there may be explanations. Meanwhile, for the aliens, no matter how hard we look, we don't see the reason. It doesn't make much sense and seems like a science fiction movie. So, if anyone has an idea of why aliens would enjoy making us believe they are the Virgin Mary, leave that in the comments. The second problem with this hypothesis of aliens is that they are not above the laws of physics. In other words, even if we imagined a civilization as advanced as we want, they still cannot go against physical phenomena, because they remain natural creatures and not supernatural ones, as the Virgin Mary would be if it were she who appeared. So, for example, how could these aliens appear and then spontaneously disappear without a spacecraft? How could they pass through stained glass? How could they make birds move without flapping their wings? Aliens, if they exist, are not magicians either. I don't want to lose you. As we explored mind-boggling things, we are not in E.T. The third problem with the hypothesis of aliens. It's simply that there is one last thing I haven't talked to you about. And yes, I told you I was saving the best for last. There is one last element, not the least, that heavily tips the balance in favor of a real supernatural appearance of the Virgin Mary. This element is that there have been numerous healing miracles among the assembly. Well, they are nice, the aliens, but I don't think they can do that. In short, the number of people healed during the apparitions is literally enormous. We don't have a precise figure, but the number of collected testimonies is staggering. After that, it's always the same refrain. Yes, it's the testimonies. Yes, the people who testify could all be lying. It could be a gigantic organized conspiracy. No, I'm joking, of course. Moreover, we have several doctors who have authenticated these complete, instantaneous, and definitive healings. Thus, every night, visitors brought sick or disabled people in wheelchairs. They were laid on the ground on prayer mats. We prayed for them in front of the Virgin Mary, and some were healed. Not all, but a significant number that doubt is no longer permitted. In light of the number of healings, an official committee composed of 7 doctors and professors was tasked with investigating the authenticity of these miracles under the direction of Dr. Shafiq Abdel. Here are some excerpts from their report. The healings were officially examined. We are demanding in the next steps guiding our research. When a miracle is declared, it has undergone honest, Rigorous examinations. A good number of miraculous cases have been studied. Some healings were not submitted to us. These patients didn't come forward. They expressed their gratitude to Saint Mary in private. Others deemed it sufficient to leave or send a document attesting to the miraculous healing they had received. Nevertheless, all the reports we received tried to accurately account for the facts. Well, all of this is nice, but I'm sure you want some concrete examples. Honestly, there were so many that it wasn't easy to select. Come on, I'll tell you just a few. The first healing that took place in Zeitoun was that of Farouk Madame Atwa, one of the bus drivers from the garage across from the church. Do you remember? Farouk had trapped the index finger of one hand time before, and a kind of gangrene had developed in his finger. For those who don't know what gangrene is, it's a finger rotting. Farouk was wearing a bandage on the finger to be amputated next day. Upon seeing this woman on the dome of the church and believing that she wanted to jump, he had shouted to her, "Madam, don't jump," and instinctively pointed his index finger, gangrenous, towards her. The next day, at the hospital, his surgeon found his finger perfectly healed and the amputation did not take place. It was the first healing. And during the weeks of appearances, healings began to pour in. For example, there is the case of Madame Zainab, blind in one eye since birth, who spent 3 consecutive nights in the church, hoping for an appearance and healing. During those nights, people slept at church courtyard. One evening, 9:30, they heard her scream, "Here is the Virgin Mary and Saint Isa." Isa is the name of Jesus for Muslims. In short, it was indeed observed later that a sort of membrane had fallen from her blind eye onto her cheek, and that this eye now saw normally. There is also the case of a 55-year-old Muslim who had heart issues, who spent an entire night praying in Zeitoun in the hope of being healed. He could barely stand and constantly needed to be supported, even carried. That night, he fell asleep, had a curious dream in which 2 angels came to heal him and announced that upon waking, he would find himself healed. At 6 a.m., he got up without needing help, and in August, these 2 doctors testified in Zeitoun over a loudspeaker that their patient now had the heart of a young man. Because yes, for all these healings, I'm giving you the short version, but we obviously have medical reports that confirmed all of this each time. And if you want a slightly longer version with excerpts from the medical reports, let me tell you about the healing of the photographer Wagi Rizkmata. It all began on June 27, 1967, when Wagi had a serious car accident. His left arm was trapped under the car, and his forearm, completely crushed, was only attached to his arm by a flap of skin. When he wakes up in the hospital, he is first operated on by Dr. Zarif Bishara, but there is nothing to be done. The muscles and tendons of the left arm have not returned to their normal position. Our doctor, Samir Farag, decides to immediately attempt another operation, which unfortunately also fails. The doctors consider amputation. In every video, I talk about amputation. If unclear, watch my previous video. Wagi, our injured patient, begs doctors to try everything to avoid it. Dr. Ali Radi then puts a cast on him, which the doctors will change regularly 9 times over 3 months. Over time, the wound begins to heal deeply, and the skin on both sides of the wound gradually comes together. Wagi Rizkmata will testify later. Dr. Radi congratulated me and said, "You have overcome. It is successful." The doctors decided they did all they could, that it was good my arm had not been amputated, and they asked me, "Do you want the arm to be stretched out like this or closed along your body?" Well, the doctors see it as a victory not to have amputated it, but it's not really a victory. Wagi is far from having regained normal use of his arm. Clearly, he can no longer use it or move it at all. Well, in February 1968, Wagi, who wants other medical opinions, meets Dr. Hassan Sanara. After examining him, he confirms, like the other doctors, that all the nerves and tendons in his arm have been severed and that all the bones have been crushed. So he makes it very clear to him that he has absolutely no chance of being able to move his forearm or hand again one day. Finally, because he still cannot accept this diagnosis, he sees one last doctor, the orthopedic surgeon Abdel El-Charkawi, who x-rays his arm without being aware of what the other doctors had said. He, however, makes the same diagnosis. He will never be able to move his arm again. We move forward and find ourselves on April 9th, 1968. That night, Wagi Mata sees the apparition. He takes photos and suddenly has the reflex to grab the camera with his left arm. However, he hasn't used it for nearly a year. He is completely healed, and instantly, he has no more pain and can fully move his entire arm and hand. He was of course then examined by several doctors, and we now have all the before and after medical reports that attest to his healing. For example, the surgeon M. Zarif Bichara Rizkmata from the Manchiette El Bakri Hospital in Cairo, who had personally operated on Wagi on June 27, 1967, will examine him again after the miracle, and will state in his report, dated May 15, 1968, examining the arm again later, before the miracle I specify, I noted that the range of motion of the arm was limited to the elbow joint, allowing only a slight flexion. All movements of the arm originated from the shoulder joint. Checking Mr. Wegi today, I noted that he was healthy and could play with his elbow in full flexion and extension. I can find no medical explanation for the range of motion in his left elbow joint. Anyway, by the way, I told you that Wagi was a photographer. Well, believe it or not, most of the photos we have of the apparition come from him. Indeed, he has always allowed the reproduction of his photos of the apparitions without asking for or accepting a penny. He explains that if he had intended to make any money from it, the Virgin would probably not have allowed him to succeed with his photos. The Virgin Mary was clearly waiting for a step of faith, and conversely, did not support all the journalists and photographers who were a bit too curious, simply seeking the supernatural and the perfect photo, for whom, during development, nothing appeared in the photos. In light of all these miracles that accompanied the apparition, we must therefore accept that none of the 5 alternative hypotheses to the miracles hold. Also, one can have fun simplifying to the extreme and rejecting all 5 hypotheses much more easily in a single sentence, because it's quite simple. The first 2 hypotheses, that everyone would have lied or that everyone would have had collective hallucinations, are simply refuted because there are photos of the event. And the other 3 hypotheses, whether it was a disguised person, a hologram, or aliens, are refuted because not everyone saw the phenomenon and it did not appear in all the photos. There is only one phenomenon, a real supernatural apparition of the Virgin Mary that can explain everything coherently. Because if she wants to be photographed, but not seen by all, she can do as she pleases. She is the Virgin. Now, an essential question arises. Why did the Virgin Mary want to appear on this Coptic church? What interest, honestly? Since this apparition of Mary appears real, the 2,400 other apparitions in history are probably not all false, if it has been shown that the Virgin Mary could appear. Once, then she could very well have done it several times throughout history. The common point of these 2,400 apparitions is that the Virgin Mary seeks to lead people to greater fervor, more faith in God. Mary does not appear to look pretty, but rather to help us convert and live for what truly matters, our relationship with God. Now, as in the hundreds of other cases in history, this is indeed what happened in Zeitoun. The faith of hundreds of thousands of Egyptians who saw the Virgin grew, and there were many conversions of Muslims who became Catholics and asked to be baptized. Well, yes, it's quite logical. When you have seen the Virgin in the literal sense, when you have seen people in the crowd get up from their stretchers and be immediately healed, it certainly strengthens our faith. God sometimes sends the Virgin Mary to bring us to Him and strengthen our faith in Him. Second why. In this case, why doesn't God do this all the time? Why doesn't He send the Virgin Mary every 5 minutes to awaken our faith? Well, to answer that, I refer you to my video on the first inexplicable mystery, where I explained that God wants to leave us free and therefore leaves us a sufficient amount of darkness so that we are free not to believe in Him. He is truly a hidden God, as the Bible says. That being said, it is clear that the amount of light that God gives us so that we can believe in Him without any doubt is still significantly greater than the small area of darkness that He leaves us for our freedom. Because in fact, well, yes, God intervenes every 5 minutes if we learn to open our eyes. The apparitions of the Virgin are numerous and frequent, as mentioned. There have been 2,400 in Milan, more than 1 per year, but we will come back to that in other videos. Third question, third why? Why here? Why did the Virgin Mary appear in Egypt, in this neighborhood of Cairo? In fact, you will see in upcoming investigations that this was not the only apparition of Mary in Egypt. There have been several others, all as impressive as Zeitoun, if not more. In the decades that followed and up until the 2000s, let's move on. In the meantime, it's interesting that the apparition of Zeitoun took place at the exact location of the flight into Egypt. So you might be wondering, what is this thing? So the flight into Egypt, recounted in the Gospels, is the moment when the Holy Family, that is to say Mary, Joseph, and the child Jesus, fled to Egypt, and they stayed there for several years because of the persecution by Herod, who wanted to kill all the babies. Well, I'll skip the details, but this apparition might be a little wink, a small sign referring to that past event. The other apparitions of Mary in Egypt that I just mentioned might be along the route taken by the Holy Family during their flight into Egypt. Lastly, the apparitions of Zeitoun were announced 6 years earlier in Lithuania. On July 13, 1962, Ramut, a young girl, claimed to have had an apparition of the Virgin. She revealed details to her that later proved to be accurate. And in her testimony, she also recounts that Mary told her, "I will do something greater so that people will start to pray and the whole world will shine and sparkle." Then further on, Ramut explains, "So I asked her, 'When will you appear again?' She replied, 'I will not reappear here. I will appear in Egypt with 2 angels. She rose above my head and disappeared. Yet, it is 1962, 6 years before the start of the apparitions. And I remind you that all the sources of what I have told you in this video are found in this book. Briefly, this unexplained mystery. This apparition of Zeitoun is indeed a miracle, a supernatural event. Well, when I say a supernatural event, well, several, yes. You will note that the apparition of Mary is an inexplicable mystery, but that all the healing miracles that accompanied it are as many other inexplicable mysteries in themselves. In short, there were hundreds of miracles just in Zeitoun, a neighborhood of Cairo, between 1968 and 1971. You see, for my series of videos on 100 strange mysteries, I counted only one case for all hundreds of miracles. Zeitoun was therefore our second case out of 100, but there are still 98 others that will follow in the upcoming videos on my YouTube channel. You understand, these 100 unexplained mysteries are 100 examples of miracles that confirm Christianity, specifically the Catholic faith, but in each of these 100 examples, there are sometimes dozens, even hundreds of cases that are grouped together, and I only count them for... Oh, and by the way, if some think that I started with the strongest cases, a leg that regrows just like that, and an apparition of the Virgin Mary in front of 1 million people that was photographed, well, actually no. You will see that in the following 100 cases, there are things just as impressive, or even much more impressive than that. I'm saving the best for last. Don't worry. Here, we will also talk about miracles in other religions. I have often noticed when there are hundreds and hundreds of miracles confirming the Catholic faith, some criticize this statement as being a layered argument. If you don't know what a layered argument is, it's giving a bunch of arguments haphazardly to support one's point, but none of these arguments are solid. And it's just the quantity of arguments that seems like solidity. Wow, so many things. But if we take each argument separately, they are worth nothing. Except that, for Catholic miracles, it is not like that at all, since each case of miracle, in itself, independently of the others, is very impressive, well documented, very solid, and difficult to refute, except to be acting in bad faith. So not only is each case solid, but also, note there are thousands of them. This means that anyone truly seeking the truth can find it. Friends, stay with me for a moment. I have something to tell you. If you are into miracles, you can click here to see another case where I investigate a severed leg that is said to have regrown. As you might suspect, these investigations cost a lot of money because I have to hire editors to focus on writing the scripts and be able to release an investigation every week. I need your help to continue because I have a huge gap in my budget to maintain this pace. So if you find these investigative videos even useful, please consider making a small monthly donation to support the channel. I am also offering a collection of quotes from saints and mystics that I have personally compiled from all the books you see behind me to anyone who makes a monthly donation of at least 20 euros. You can click on the link in the description and in the pinned comment to learn more. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. To all those who are already supporting and to those who will support in the future to allow these videos to exist. This was Ignis. Don't forget to subscribe because we'll meet again next week for the next miracles. Ciao!